Burbank, California, 1948. A 16-year-old girl enters the Miss Burbank contest wearing a swimsuit patched back together by hand, and she enters it not because she dreams of a movie career, but because every contestant walks away with a free blouse and a free scarf, and she wants the blouse and the scarf. The whole plan ends there. Collect the clothes and walk home to a working-class family with no particular connection to the movie business. Instead, she wins, and the win sets off a chain of events that hands her a studio contract and 4 years later a spot next to Gene Kelly in a musical that required her to dance, which she could not do. $60 a week. MGM paid that at the start for the rights to a face it would spend the next decade selling as the most wholesome girl in America. Ask most people about Debbie Reynolds now, and the same short list of images comes back. The girl in Singin' in the Rain, Carrie Fisher's mother, the face on the nightclub posters, the sweet little wife Elizabeth Taylor swiped a husband from, perky, tiny, harmless, a human glass of milk. Almost nobody pictures a woman who bought a Las Vegas casino against the advice of everyone around her, won a divorce judgment of nearly $9 million against a husband, spent decades sleeping on cruise ships to clear debts other men left behind, and ran a mental health charity for more than half a century while doing all of it. So this video covers a gap, but not the gap between a lie and a fact. The devout, broke, working-class girl from Burbank existed, and MGM did not invent her. What the studio hid and what she kept hiding long after the studio stopped paying her. How much iron it took to keep that soft picture standing, and how often the picture nearly collapsed under the weight of the men she married. MGM knew exactly what it signed. A teenager from a religious, working-class Burbank family, no acting training, no dance training, a church background, and a face that photographed like a Sunday school poster. The studio did not try to polish any of that away. It packaged it. Publicity promoted her as the embodiment of wholesome middle American values, and the pitch worked partly because the details underneath it happened to match her actual life, which in studio-era Hollywood counts as a novelty. She lived at home. She wore dresses her mother sewed, and she kept wearing them into the mid-1950s, well after her paychecks could cover anything on a department store rack, because the homemade dress belonged to the character MGM needed her to play off camera as much as on it. Think about the discipline that takes. A young woman whose fame climbs year after year, walking onto the lot in something her mother stitched at home, smiling because the brand asked for it. Reynolds herself described the arrangement bluntly decades later. Looking back at the contract years for Backstage, she called herself and the other young women on the lot lovable, the girl next door, and admitted that the roles MGM handed them all looked alike. Same part, different title. Repeat until the public cannot tell the difference between the actress and the costume, and then keep repeating because the costume sells. And in fairness, the image sat on a real foundation because she did attend church and she did come from very little. The studio did not need to fake the sweetness, it only needed to hide everything else, and everything else included a will so stubborn that it would later keep her on the road for decades, paying off debts she never personally ran up. Everything else also included a physical stamina the studio discovered the hard way. On a soundstage in 1952 with Gene Kelly standing over her. Which brings us to the pianos. Singin' in the Rain came out in 1952, and MGM cast Reynolds in it at 19, opposite Gene Kelly, in a musical built almost entirely around dancing at a moment when Reynolds did not know how to dance. Not merely that she needed a little polish, but that she did not know how at all. The studio decided the girl next door would now dance for a living, and the girl next door needed to learn fast in front of a man who did not grade on a curve. Kelly ran rehearsals like a drill sergeant. He carried a reputation as a harsh taskmaster, and Reynolds, who could not match his technique and could not afford to fall behind, responded the only way her upbringing taught her, which meant working until her body quit and then working past that. The rehearsals turned grueling in a way the finished film never lets you see, because the entire point of a musical lies in disguising the hardest thing on the set as a Tuesday afternoon. The emotional cost surfaced in a story retold every time her name comes up. Fred Astaire, working on the lot, found Reynolds crying underneath a piano, and rather than step around her, he volunteered to help with her dancing. Picture the scene. The sweetest face at MGM, the girl in the homemade dresses curled up under a piano because a 19-year-old body reached the limit of what Gene Kelly demanded from it. People usually tell that story as a charming anecdote about Astaire's kindness, and it qualifies. But it also tells you something the publicity department never volunteered. The wholesome image ran on a level of punishment that sent the star hiding under furniture. MGM sold lightness. Reynolds paid for it in rehearsal hours the audience never counted, and the audience never counted them because she saw to it that the finished product never showed the math. And that pattern, a bright surface financed by brutal private labor, repeats for the next 60 years through 3 marriages, a casino, a costume collection of 5,000 pieces, and a daughter who would eventually put the whole arrangement in a novel. The next person to cash in on it did not run a studio, he slept down the hall. In 1955, Reynolds married the singer Eddie Fisher, and the press, never one to pass up an easy headline, crowned them America's sweethearts. The label fit the brand perfectly. The wholesome girl next door landed her wholesome crooner. The fan magazines could run the wedding photos for years, and nobody involved seemed to notice that a title like that amounts to a loan, not a gift, and loans come due. The bill arrived in 1958. Mike Todd, the producer married to Elizabeth Taylor, died in a plane crash that year, and Eddie Fisher stepped in to comfort the grieving widow. Comforting turned into something else, and something else turned into a highly public affair between Fisher and Taylor, conducted in front of a press corps that could not believe its luck. Now, you need to understand how the newspapers cast this. Taylor became the homewrecker, full stop, a temptress who reached into the sweetest marriage in America and pulled the husband out of it by the collar. Reynolds became the victim, the wronged wife standing in the doorway with 2 children. No nuance, no shared blame, 2 roles written before anyone checked whether either woman wanted to play them. And then something happened that tells you a lot about how Hollywood actually works. The scandal did not hurt Taylor's career, it helped it. Her next film, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, released in 1958, rode a wave of box office interest generated in no small part by audiences who now wanted a good look at the woman who took Eddie Fisher. The studio leaned into it. Marketing for the film put Taylor front and center in a slip, the kind of image that, after the headlines, read less like costume design and more like a dare. In fairness, the slip did not come out of a publicity meeting. Tennessee Williams wrote Maggie the Cat, spending most of the first act of his 1955 play in a slip, so the costume sat in the source material long before the affair, and the studio simply noticed that the costume and the scandal pointed in the same direction and printed the posters. So, quick scoreboard. Taylor lost a husband to a plane crash, gained a new one in public, absorbed every name in the book, and sold a lot of tickets. Fisher traded one famous wife for another. Reynolds, the only one of the 3 who chose none of this, walked away with 2 kids, a dead marriage, a nation's sympathy, and a lesson about publicity she never forgot, and sympathy, for the record, buys exactly nothing at the grocery store. Sympathy, it turns out, converts into capital, and Reynolds understood that sooner than the people pitying her did. She read the room. The easy version of this story paints her as a passive casualty, crying into a handkerchief while the tabloids did the fighting, and the actual version shows her reading the moment with a precision that would impress her old publicity department. She played the dignified wronged wife, and she played it well, handing the press exactly the composed, wounded figure it wanted, and collecting an enormous reservoir of public goodwill in return. No public meltdowns and no tabloid war. The image held, which counts as the entire job of an image. Then, years later, she did the one thing a permanent victim cannot do. She outgrew the part. It took a while. Reynolds and Taylor found themselves on the same cruise ship. And somewhere out on the water, the betrayed wife and the homewrecker reconciled, far from any reporter who might want the story, which probably explains why it worked. And then the two of them pushed it further. In 2001, they appeared together in a TV movie called These Old Broads and spoofed the whole affair on camera, turning the scandal that once dominated the headlines into a punchline they controlled. Read that again. The woman the press sold as the helpless victim took the worst public humiliation of her life, waited it out for more than 40 years, and then monetized it on television alongside the woman who caused it. A victim does not do that. A producer does that. And keep it in mind for everything that follows, because the public kept seeing a sweet, slightly unlucky woman right up until the moment she started buying hotels. In 1970, MGM held an auction of its own history, and Debbie Reynolds showed up to buy it. That sentence sounds small, and it carries a lot. The studio that paid her $60 a week as a teenager decided to sell off the physical evidence of its golden years, and the teenager, now in her late 30s, stood there spending her own money to save what her former employer treated as surplus inventory. That auction started a habit that lasted decades. Piece by piece, sale by sale, Reynolds assembled a collection of roughly 5,000 items of Hollywood memorabilia, spending millions of her own dollars on it, while the industry that produced those items mostly looked the other way. Marilyn Monroe's white dress from The 7-Year Itch, the one from the subway grate. Audrey Hepburn's ascot gown from My Fair Lady. 5,000 pieces bought one at a time by a woman the public still pictured as a girl in a homemade dress. Think about what that reveals about the person the public filed under Perky. Collecting at that scale stops counting as a hobby and starts counting as an obsession with a bank account attached. And it reveals somebody who looked at the studio system that manufactured her and decided, apparently alone, that its physical remains deserved saving even if the studio itself shrugged. She did not wait for a museum to do it. She became the museum. And then came the decision that would eventually cost her the whole thing. She wanted a building to hold it, and she wanted that building in Las Vegas with her own name over the door, an ambition her friends looked at and almost to a person told her to drop. In 1992, Reynolds paid $10 million for a Las Vegas hotel and renamed it the Debbie Reynolds Hotel and Casino, with the collection as the centerpiece attraction. Her friends advised against it. She bought it anyway because Debbie Reynolds, the real one, did not take instructions from people who thought she should stay smaller. On paper, the logic holds together. A famous name, a one-of-a-kind collection, a building with her face on the sign, and a city full of tourists looking for something to do between blackjack hands. In practice, the hotel failed, and failed badly enough that by 1997 she filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection 5 years after buying the place. The collection survived the casino for a while. Reynolds kept looking for a permanent home for it, and she believed Tennessee would finally provide one, where a developer planned a museum to house the entire collection under one roof. Then the developer collapsed into bankruptcy, the museum plans fell through with him, and in 2011, with creditors waiting and no building left to promise them, a woman who described herself as heartbroken put 40 years of collecting up for auction to pay what she owed. So the costumes she rescued from MGM's auction block in 1970 ended up on another auction block in 2011, sold to cover debts from a hotel she bought to display them. The circle closes with a gavel, Monroe's dress, Hepburn's gown, the whole 5,000 scattered again to whoever bid highest, which roughly matches what MGM wanted to do with them 4 decades earlier before a young actress stepped in the way. But notice what that story skips so far. The casino did not happen in a vacuum, and the bankruptcy did not happen to a woman managing her own money alone, because Reynolds almost never managed her own money alone, and that habit cost her more than any hotel. A husband stood in the middle of it, and with Reynolds, a husband usually did. Not one of the fairy tale romances Reynolds acted out on screen ever showed up in her own house. She married 3 times. A reasonable person looking at the ledger could argue that each marriage cost her more than it paid, with the possible exception of the first, which at least produced 2 children before it blew apart in front of the entire country. Eddie Fisher, 1955 to 1959, we covered already. He left for Elizabeth Taylor and left Reynolds a single working mother of 2, which in the 1950s meant something different than it means now and not in the easy direction. Harry Carl, 1960 to 1973, slips most people's memory, and he did the most damage. 13 years. A shoe magnate by every public description, Carl married Reynolds as the stable, moneyed grown-up after the Fisher circus, and for the entire marriage he hid a severe gambling addiction that quietly fed on money she earned. When the marriage ended, Reynolds opened the books and discovered what he did with them. The money no longer existed. 2 decades of studio work and touring converted into cash and then into losses, and in its place sat debts exceeding $10 million, run up by a man she trusted with the finances because her era trained wives to hand over exactly that without asking. Richard Hamlet, 1984 to 1996, came next, and if you sense a pattern, you sit ahead of where Reynolds stood at the time. Hamlet developed real estate. The 2 of them bought the Las Vegas casino together, which means the $10 million hotel sat on top of a marriage, and when the hotel collapsed, the marriage collapsed with it, ending in a 1996 divorce decree that ordered Hamlet to pay Reynolds $8.9 million to cover property and legal fees, plus money he borrowed from her. The husband borrowed money from the wife lost the hotel, and then the wife won a judgment against the husband for the money, which tells you who in that marriage actually held the assets to begin with. Now, the honest version of this section does not stop at blaming the men, and Reynolds herself refused to stop there either. She did not plead innocence. In her 2013 memoir, Unsinkable, she admitted, without much softening, that she ignored glaring red flags and signed financial documents without reading them, handing over total control of her earnings because that matched what her era expected of a wife. Willful blindness by her own accounting, not bad luck. So the same iron will that survived Gene Kelly and outlasted the Taylor scandal apparently switched off the moment a husband handed her a pen. That contradiction sits at the center of the whole story. A woman capable of running a charity for half a century and assembling a collection she spent millions on could not bring herself to read her own bank statements, because somewhere in Burbank in the 1940s she absorbed the idea that money belonged to men, and that idea cost her more than any casinos. Somebody needed to pay those debts, and each time the bill landed on Reynolds. Not Carl, who gambled the money away, and not Hamlet, who borrowed it. The woman who never ran up the debts set out and earned the money back, and she did it the only way a former MGM contract player with no studio behind her could, which meant performing anywhere that would pay for as long as it took. That meant nightclubs. That meant cruise ships, the circuit with steady money and no glamour. According to a CBS profile from 2000, it meant living on the road up to 42 weeks a year, decade after decade, a schedule that would flatten a performer half her age and that she kept up while paying down debts that belonged, morally if not legally, to other people. Do the arithmetic on 42 weeks. That leaves 10 weeks a year at home for a woman with 2 children and a charity to run. And it leaves that little because the alternative, letting the debts stand and walking away, apparently never occurred to her as an option. So the next time somebody calls her perky, remember the cruise ship. The bubbly girl from the posters spent a large part of her adult life living out of a suitcase, singing for rooms full of strangers to pay off 2 men who never spent a single week on a cruise ship paying her back. And then, the daughter. Carrie Fisher grew up inside all of this, the scandal, the husbands, the touring, the homemade image, and she grew up famous herself, which handed the public a second sweet story to project onto. The star mother and the star daughter, a sitcom family with better lighting. Fisher described it differently. In the documentary Bright Lights, she put it this way: The two of them didn't grow up with each other. We grew up around each other, and she remembered a childhood spent perpetually preparing for a photo shoot. Not with, around. A childhood in permanent preparation for the camera, the childhood that comes with a mother paid to look like the ideal mother on a magazine cover. Nothing about the relationship that grew out of that childhood resembled a sitcom, volatile and fiercely competitive, and underneath the fighting so tightly bound that neither woman managed to live without the other for long. Fisher turned it into fiction in 1987 with Postcards from the Edge, a semi-autobiographical novel about a megastar mother and a struggling drug-addicted daughter who cannot stand each other and cannot stay apart. And Mike Nichols adapted it into a film in 1990, which means The Private Mess became a public text twice. Consider how that reads from the mother's side. Reynolds spent her entire career controlling her image, from the homemade dresses to the memoirs she would write later, and her own daughter published a novel that pulled the curtain back on the one relationship Reynolds could not script. That the bond survived, it tells you something. That it still broke for stretches into outright estrangement tells you something else. And yet, by the end, they lived next door to each other. Bright Lights, filmed in their later years, caught that arrangement on camera, mother and daughter a few steps apart, and what it recorded, according to the people who reviewed it, looked a lot less like a feud and a lot more like tenderness. Then Carrie Fisher died, and one day later her mother followed. Hold that for a moment. The woman who survived, Gene Kelly, Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth Taylor, two financial catastrophes, a bankrupt casino, and roughly 4 decades on the road, lasted exactly one day after her daughter. Read into that what you want. The timeline does not care about sentiment, but try looking at those 2 dates without seeing the bond Fisher wrote about in 1987 playing out to its literal end. Almost none of this reaches the musical's montage, and neither does the next part. In the mid-1950s, right around the time she still turned up on the lot in her mother's dresses, Reynolds co-founded a charity called the Thalians, dedicated to raising awareness and money for mental health. In the 1950s, think about what that cause looked like at the time, when the subject carried enough stigma that most people in public life would not speak the words out loud, let alone attach their name to a fundraising organization built around them. The girl next door picked it anyway, and then she ran it. She held the presidency of the Thalians almost without interruption from 1957 to 2011, 54 years. And over that stretch, the organization raised millions for the mental health center at Cedars-Sinai and for UCLA's Operation Mend, which treats veterans with psychological and physical wounds. 54 years. Most careers do not last that long, and she ran a charity for that long in what a generous person might call her spare time, meaning the 10 weeks a year when she stepped off the cruise ship. The Thalians did not exhaust the list. In the 1980s, when the AIDS crisis arrived and a lot of public figures found reasons to stay elsewhere, Reynolds showed up at AIDS fundraisers, which put her among the early allies of the LGBTQ+ community at a moment when that cost something. In 2015, the Academy handed her the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award for the whole body of that work 1 year before she died. So add it up. The same decades the public remembers as the perky years of nightclub acts also contained a 54-year charity presidency and AIDS fundraising in a decade when plenty of famous people stayed home. None of that fit the brand, so none of it reached the montage. Reynolds wrote 3 memoirs, Debbie, My Life in 1988, Unsinkable in 2013, and Make 'em Laugh in 2015. And if the earlier sections of this video taught you anything about her relationship with publicity, you can probably guess what job those books did. She did not write them to confess. Critics liked them. Leonard Maltin called Unsinkable a lively, funny book filled with candid recollections and candid fits up to a point, because she wrote openly about the financial ruin, the husbands, the bankruptcy, all of it. But read the titles again, starting with Unsinkable. Molly Brown, the role that earned her an Oscar nomination, a character named for refusing to sink, and Reynolds borrowed that name for the cover of her own life story on purpose. The books stay honest about the disasters and careful about the conclusion. Every betrayal, every red flag she signed past, every auction, every bankruptcy filing, all of it appears and all of it arrives through a narrator who emerges at the end as the resilient heroine, the one who took the hits and kept singing. That framing does not amount to a lie, so call it an edit. Look at who survived. Which means the woman who started her career wearing her mother's dresses to protect a studio's version of her finished it by writing 3 books to protect her own version of her, and she did the second job better. The studio system that built The Girl Next Door collapsed, and her husbands drained her and left. The image maker outlasted every one of them, and she ensured that the last word on the subject across 3 separate volumes carried her byline. Debbie Reynolds died of a stroke on December 28th, 2016, at the age of 84, one day after her daughter. And almost immediately something shifted in how the obituaries described her. The America's Sweetheart label, the one she wore through the 1950s like one of those homemade dresses, did not lead the coverage. And for a woman who spent 68 years in public, it fell away fast. What led the coverage instead looked like a different person entirely, a Hollywood titan and a pioneer of film preservation. The title you earn by spending millions saving costumes a studio wanted to dump. A formidable, if flawed, businesswoman too, the kind who buys a casino and then loses it. Not a sweetheart. Above all, an iron-willed survivor who outlasted the studio system that created her, the husbands who bankrupted her, the creditors who took her collection, and the shifting tastes of an industry that kept no real place for a girl next door once the girl grew up. None of which she would object to because she spent 3 memoirs drawing exactly that portrait. So, the contradiction this whole video keeps circling comes down to this. MGM built a girl next door out of a real girl and sold her for $60 a week. The real girl spent the rest of her life both living up to that image and quietly demolishing it, crying under pianos, buying casinos, suing husbands, running a mental health charity for 54 years, dragging 5,000 costumes through a casino and a bankruptcy court, singing on cruise ships to pay debts she never ran up. And at the end, she picked up the same tools the studio used on her and wrote the final version herself. Consider the joke of it. The girl next door turned out tougher than anyone on the block, and she just never let you see her sweat because sweat never appeared anywhere in the contract. Anyway, that covers the story. If you want more of these, you know where the subscribe button lives, and unlike an MGM contract, it requires no dancing and comes with no dress code.